Zach lifted his beer with the kind of confidence that filled the whole backyard. To Michelle, he said with a grin, "Our family's paper pilot." The entire table burst into laughter. Every face turned toward me like I was part of the entertainment. Some looked amused. Some looked proud of the joke. None of them knew what burning metal smells like after a mission. None of them had heard soldiers screaming through a broken radio while a helicopter dropped from the sky. And none of them had any idea who Revenant 1 really was. I smiled anyway. Sometimes staying quiet feels safer than telling the truth. But as their laughter carried through the warm summer air that night, I made myself a promise. The next time they tried to make me feel small, I wouldn't sit there in silence. My name is Michelle Butler. And that was the last summer I allowed anyone to mistake my silence for weakness. The laughter continued across the backyard. Normally, those sounds would have felt comforting, familiar even. But that night, every laugh felt heavier than before. Zach was deep into another one of his speeches, talking about discipline, toughness, and what real military people are made of. His words floated through the air while everyone listened like he was some kind of authority. Nobody even glanced at me. They didn't need to. In their minds, they already knew exactly who I was supposed to be. I sat quietly in my chair, both hands wrapped around a beer can so cold it almost hurt. Without realizing it, I squeezed hard enough to bend the aluminum. Nobody noticed. Maybe they forgot I was even sitting there. Maybe that made things easier for them. The Butler family had always been built on loud opinions, loud personalities, and constant pride. There was never much space for someone quiet like me. And over time, I learned that silence caused fewer problems than honesty ever could. When Zach lifted his drink toward his father, Captain Roland Butler, pride immediately spread across the older man's face. I watched them carefully. Father and son. Both so confident. So loud. So certain that attention naturally belonged to them. And, for a second, I found myself wondering if there had ever been room in this family for someone who didn't need applause to feel valuable. A cool breeze carrying the smell of salt pulled me away before I even realized I had left the table. I walked toward the beach while the laughter slowly faded behind me. Soon, all I could hear were the waves crashing against the shore. Barefoot, I stood at the edge of the water while the cold tide rolled around my ankles. And quietly, under my breath, I made another promise. One day, the silence that kept me invisible would finally break. Not through anger. Through truth. I grew up on the coast, in a place where people believed 3 rules held every family together. Stay quiet. Work hard. Never cross the line. By the time I turned 25, I had already broken all 3. Back home, my Uncle Roland's name meant everything people admired. Strength. Medals. Stories repeated after too many drinks late at night. He was the hero everyone talked about. Zach was supposed to continue that legacy. And me? I was just the girl who flew planes. The polite little side note nobody paid attention to during family conversations. Everyone loved talking about heroes. They just never realized one of them was already sitting at the same table. I let them believe whatever they wanted. Because the truth I carried came stamped with the word classified. Still, there were nights when the memories came back whether I wanted them or not. The cockpit flashing red. Emergency alarm screaming. The radio filled with panic. We're pinned down. Revenant 1, do you copy? Then my own voice answering calmly through the chaos. Copy. I'm not leaving you behind. Weeks later, back on base, my commanding officer called me into his office. He spoke carefully, almost like he regretted saying it. Captain Roland Butler owes his team's lives to you. He knows you were the one who brought them home. I remember freezing in place. Suddenly, everything made sense. Roland knew. The same man who spent years building Zach up as the family's military pride knew that I had once saved his men during an extraction mission. Literally under my protection. And he chose to stay silent. Maybe it was for Zach. Maybe it was for the family name. Maybe he thought the truth would damage the image they had created. But whatever the reason was, I carried the cost of that silence. One evening, while the sun disappeared behind the water, my father sat beside me and quietly said something I never forgot. Some people get applause. Others get the sound of engines. That was his way of telling me he understood. He saw me, even if nobody else did. But by then, silence no longer felt comforting. It felt heavy, like pressure sitting on my chest, like salt rubbed into an open wound. And I finally realized something. If Roland wanted silence, then maybe I needed to choose something different. Maybe it was time to step into the light instead. The moon sat high over the ocean the night I walked back down to the beach. Cold sand shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't surprised when I saw Roland standing there alone with a beer in his hand, staring out at the dark water. He spoke before even turning around. "Thank you, Michelle. I know you were Revenant One." The words hit hard. Quick. Sharp. Impossible to ignore. I answered quietly. "I was just doing my job." Then I looked directly at him. "But you could have said something. Just once." He let out a long breath. "I didn't want Zach feeling smaller." I nodded slowly. "Instead, you made me smaller." He didn't fight back. Didn't defend himself. He only stared at the ocean and gave a slow nod. "You're right," he admitted. "My team still owes you. But where I come from, men in service don't say thank you out loud. We remember instead." I studied him in the moonlight. A man shaped by command, discipline, and old habits. He wasn't cruel. Not really. He was trapped inside the thinking of his generation, where emotion stayed hidden and acknowledgement felt dangerous. But the system they protected so fiercely was suffocating the rest of us. I stayed calm when I answered him. I didn't need to raise my voice. "Keep your silence if that makes life easier for you," I said. "But the next time somebody laughs at me, I won't stay quiet." For the first time that night, Roland turned fully toward me. His expression softened. "Good," he said quietly. "You've earned that right." The tide rolled closer, foam brushing against our feet while moonlight reflected across the water. And standing there beside him, everything suddenly became clear. The difference between pride and love, between loyalty and fear. I turned and started walking back toward the house while distant laughter echoed through the night behind me. And deep down, I knew something had changed forever. That would be the last summer my silence protected everyone except me. I wouldn't stay quiet again. 2 years later, I came back home a different person. The confidence I gained in the sky no longer disappeared just because I stepped into my family's backyard. The same smoke filled the air. The same old country songs played through cheap speakers. The same familiar voices carried across the yard. Nothing around me had changed. Except me. Zach stood beside the grill, already putting on a performance for the crowd. He lifted his beer again and smirked. "Welcome home, Captain Butler. Heard the Navy's keeping you busy with meetings and paperwork." A few people laughed automatically. But this time, I didn't stay silent. I smiled calmly and answered, "Depends on the altitude." The laughter died instantly. The entire backyard went quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Roland slowly looked up from his chair. And for the first time, I saw two things in his eyes at once: pride and warning. I sat quietly, watching the same routine play out all over again. Everyone at the table kept praising Zach. His gym, his training programs, his discipline, his work ethic. Nobody asked about me. I was still treated like the quiet relative who smiled politely and stayed out of the spotlight. Then another voice joined the conversation. Sergeant Mason Hale, one of Roland's old SEAL friends, slapped Roland on the shoulder and laughed. "Hey, remember that pilot who got your team out of Mogadishu, Cap? What was that call sign again?" The entire atmosphere changed instantly. The air felt still. Roland hesitated for a second before forcing out a smile. "Revenant One," he said quietly. "Hell of a pilot." My heartbeat stumbled. He said it almost like an admission of guilt. Nobody noticed except me. I looked directly at him. He avoided my eyes. For once, his silence didn't come from pride. It came from regret. Meanwhile, Zach stayed completely unaware. He laughed and took another sip of beer. Well, whoever that pilot was, at least she had guts. Some people only know how to fly simulators. I slowly placed my drink on the table. Some of us fly missions where there are no second chances. The words landed hard. Sharp. Final. Before anyone could answer, I stood up and walked toward the beach. I could feel Roland watching me the entire way. The storm wasn't out over the ocean. It was sitting right there at the dinner table, waiting to explode. That summer night carried a strange kind of heat. Fireworks burst above the water, while music and laughter filled the backyard. Zach stood in the center of it all, entertaining everyone with another performance about toughness and military-style training. Every word scraped against my nerves. Inside the house, my mother stirred lemonade and smiled gently. "Roland's son is doing so well," she said proudly. "And your flying is nice too, honey. Just dangerous." I smiled back. The kind of smile that never fully reaches your eyes. Outside, Zach spotted me walking back toward the yard. "Hey, Michelle," he shouted, grinning. "Maybe next year you'll join us for some real military training." Laughter exploded around him again. Even Roland said nothing. Then a small voice cut through the noise. "Dad," Evan asked innocently, "isn't Aunt Michelle in the military too?" The laughter stopped immediately. Zach forced out an awkward chuckle. "Well, not that kind of military." I crouched down to Evan's level and looked him in the eyes. "Maybe one day you'll understand what that really means." He nodded with wide-eyed curiosity. And somehow, that child's honesty hit harder than any insult the adults had thrown at me. Later that night, I found Roland sitting alone at the kitchen table. A half-empty beer rested near his shaking hand. "You know this isn't harmless anymore, right?" I asked quietly. He nodded slowly. "I just don't want this family turning into a battlefield." I crossed my arms. "Your silence already turned it into one. You made Zach think he's untouchable." Roland looked exhausted, years of regret sitting behind his eyes. Then he said something unexpected. "Maybe it's time someone else fired the first shot." Outside, fireworks exploded across the night sky again, smoke drifting past the windows. And in the reflection on the glass, I finally saw myself clearly. Not weak. Not invisible. Just steady. Ready. The next time they came at me with laughter, I wasn't going to shrink back. Next time, the truth would hit harder than any joke. 3 years after that summer, I returned home once more. The Florida heat wrapped around everything, thick with salt air and barbecue smoke. Captain Roland Butler's 60th birthday had become a massive gathering. Old SEAL teammates, neighbors, family friends, the backyard looked more like a reunion of legends than a birthday party. And right in the center of it all stood Zach. Loud as always. Confident as always. Telling Jim stories like they were combat missions. His friends laughed too hard at every sentence. The moment he noticed me, he lifted his beer with that same familiar smirk. "Michelle's back. Hey, Commander, still flying a desk these days." Laughter rolled through the crowd. I slowly placed my glass on the table and looked him straight in the eye. "Still flying, Zach. Just not as low as you think." The laughter disappeared instantly. Roland looked up sharply from his chair. There was something complicated in his expression. Warning. Respect. Maybe both. Zach tried brushing it off with another laugh. "Relax. I'm joking. You know I love you, right?" I answered calmly. "You love hearing yourself talk." A drunk former SEAL leaned forward with curiosity. "You military too, sweetheart? What's your call sign?" Zach smirked again. "Oh yeah, let's hear this. Maybe something like paper wings." I looked around the table. Every face waited for me to laugh along like usual. Instead, I took a slow breath. Revenant 1. The silence hit instantly. One of the veterans stared at me in shock. "Wait, you were the pilot in Mogadishu?" Before I could answer, Roland stood up. His posture changed immediately. Command filled his voice again. "Zach," he said firmly, "apologize. Right now." Zach blinked in confusion. "Dad, it was just a joke." "Apologize for what?" Roland's voice cut through the backyard. "For mocking the pilot who saved my men." The color drained from Zach's face. "You mean, her?" Roland nodded slowly. "She flew through fire to bring us home." "And you laughed at her." The crowd stayed completely silent. Then Roland added quietly, "You never asked." Zach looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. "I didn't know," he whispered. I stood there in the silence while the truth settled over everyone. Finally, Zach looked down. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," I answered softly. "But both of us knew it wasn't." Roland walked toward me and reached into his pocket. He placed a brass coin into my palm. To the one who flew through fire, he said quietly, "You earned this years ago. I should have given it to you then." Fireworks exploded in the distance beyond the trees, but nobody at the table spoke. Later that night, I drove along the coastline with the windows down. The air smelled like smoke and salt water. The brass coin reflected passing headlights in my hand. For the first time in years, I didn't feel angry. I felt free, like something heavy inside me had finally broken loose. A few minutes later, Roland's truck pulled up behind me near the water. He stepped out slowly, sleeves rolled up. Not a captain anymore. Just a man carrying regret. "You shouldn't have had to wait for me to speak," he admitted. "But I did," I answered. He handed me a folded document. Operation Revenant. My name was buried beneath thick black classified markings. "They covered everything," Roland said quietly. "But none of us ever forgot your call sign." His eyes looked glassy under the moonlight. "I thought staying silent would protect you," he admitted. "But really, it only protected my pride and Zach's." "Yeah," I said softly. "Him too." Then he pulled another coin from his pocket. Older. Worn smooth with time. "This one's from my team," he said. "We kept it until the day we could finally thank you properly." I held both coins in my hand while moonlight reflected off the metal. "We're okay, Captain," I told him. "Just don't stay silent anymore." He nodded toward the ocean. No more silence. As I turned to leave, he stopped me with one final sentence. "Zach isn't angry at you. He's angry because he never earned what you did." I looked back toward the waves. "Then maybe it's time he learns how." The cool wind shifted around us. I closed my fingers around the coins while the tide carried away the last sounds of the night. No more silence. 3 years after that night beside the ocean, I stood on a runway in Pensacola. Sunlight reflected off metals, brass buttons, and polished aircraft. I had been called there to receive a Navy commendation for outstanding service during joint operations. New missions. New skies. And this time, nothing about it was secret. The hangar doors stood open. Cameras waited. A military band played steadily nearby. Then I looked into the crowd and froze. Roland was standing there wearing his old SEAL dress uniform. The ribbons on his chest had faded with time, but his posture remained straight and proud. He had never attended anyone's ceremony before. For a brief moment, it felt like the past and present had collided. When the applause finally faded, Roland walked toward me carrying an old SEAL cap in his hands. "You wear the uniform better than any of us ever did," he said. I smiled despite the emotion building in my throat. "Don't exaggerate, Captain." Then something happened I never expected. Roland straightened fully and saluted me. The entire crowd went still. Several SEAL veterans nearby slowly followed his lead. I returned the salute. No words were necessary. This was the acknowledgement that had taken 10 years to arrive. After the ceremony, Roland handed me a faded photograph. It showed a much younger version of him standing beside a military pilot whose face had been washed out by sunlight. "Never learned her name," he murmured quietly. "Now I understand why." That night, my phone buzzed. A message from Zach appeared on the screen. "Saw the video. You deserved it. Proud of you." Short. Simple. Honest. And somehow, that was enough. The reflection from the metal blurred as tears filled my eyes. Not from pain anymore. From peace. 2 generations. 1 salute. And finally, no silence left between us. A year later, summer returned feeling softer than before. The Butler backyard no longer echoed with loud bragging and forced laughter. Now there was only the sound of the grill crackling, leaves moving in the wind, and children running through the grass. Zach had changed too. He now worked with veterans, helping former soldiers adjust to civilian life. For the first time, his voice carried patience instead of ego. When I walked into the backyard, the conversations paused. I wore a simple uniform. No medals. No ribbons. Just service. Zach stood from his chair and smiled. But this time, there was no performance in it. "Everyone," he announced, "meet Commander Butler, the pilot who brought my father home." Warm applause spread across the table. Real applause. Not mocking. Not forced. Roland stayed seated quietly, his eyes shining while he watched me. My mother leaned close and whispered, "Finally, people know who you really are." I smiled gently. "That's not why I came." Then Evan, now 6 years old, energetic and curious, ran over to me and tried standing at attention like a soldier. "Dad says you flew through storms to save people." I knelt beside him. I just didn't leave them behind. Something in the moment broke open emotionally. Roland lowered his head as tears rolled down his face. Zach placed a shaking hand on my shoulder. "I should have known better," he admitted quietly. "Now you do," I answered with a smile. Not pride. Relief. Later that evening, as the sunset turned the sky gold, Roland found me standing near the porch. He held out the old seal coin again, its edges smooth from years of handling. "This belongs to you," he said softly. "It always did." I glanced toward Evan, sticky fingers wrapped around a melted popsicle while he stared at the shining coin with fascination. "Keep it," I told Roland. "Let him see it every day. Let him understand what it means." Roland nodded slowly before placing the coin carefully into Evan's hand. Sunlight reflected off the metal and danced through the trees. And for the first time, everything felt complete. The laughter, the silence, the years between us. All of it finally healed into something whole. Zach watched the light reflecting across his son's hand before looking back at me. "Guess we both found what we were searching for." "Respect?" I asked. He shook his head. "Peace." The last rays of sunlight slowly disappeared, leaving behind only the warmth of family and the calm sounds of evening. And this time, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. 12 years had passed since that first summer when laughter hurt more than silence ever could. I returned to Jacksonville during leave, driving along the same coastal road lined with pine trees and salty air. The old Butler house still stood proudly near the water. The paint had faded from years of sunlight, but the porch now displayed a history worth remembering. There were framed photographs everywhere. Roland in uniform, Zach shaking hands with veterans, Evan smiling beside his father. And tucked among them was a smaller frame, me in my flight suit with sunlight reflecting off my helmet. Below it were handwritten words, "Revenant One Family of the Brave." Inside the house, Evan, now 18, carefully cleaned the glass display holding the old seal coin. He turned toward me thoughtfully. "Aunt Michelle, were you scared that night?" "Yes," I answered honestly. "But courage isn't about having no fear. It's about flying anyway." He smiled softly. "Dad says bravery runs in the Butler blood." I shook my head gently. "No, bravery comes from choices." Behind us, the screen door creaked open. Roland stepped outside slowly with a cane in his hand. Older now, slower too, but still carrying that same quiet authority. "You taught this family what service really means," he said warmly. I laughed softly. "Took a few barbecues to make it happen." Roland chuckled as cicadas hummed in the evening air. Then suddenly, jets roared overhead. T-45s cut through the sky in perfect formation. Sunlight flashed across their wings and reflected onto the coin in Evan's hand. For one brief moment, the entire porch glowed. I looked at Evan, then at Roland, and quietly said, "The people who matter already understand. The rest will catch up eventually." The jets disappeared into the blue sky. Roland leaned back in his chair with his eyes half closed. Evan stood proudly with the coin shining in his hand. And in that moment, I realized something. Honor doesn't live in medals or speeches. It lives in understanding. And after surviving every storm, the sky still belonged to us.